She walked up to my front porch like she owned the place. Clipboard in one hand, a big ring of keys in the other. Her heels clicked loudly on the steps as if every sound needed to announce her presence. Anyone who lived in our neighborhood knew her. The self-appointed HOA queen. Her name was Karen, and if you've dealt with an HOA, you already know the type, rules for you, but not for her. I watched from the kitchen window, already feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't knock. She didn't even pause. She just scanned the lock, held up a key, and gave it a try. The key didn't work. She frowned and tried another. I froze. See, this wasn't some broken street lamp or a forgotten trash bin notice. She was trying to get inside my home. No notice, no call, no emergency. Just full-on trying to let herself in. Like I had no say in it at all. I moved quickly, not out of panic, but because I knew what she was doing was way out of line. And because I wasn't the only one home. My son was visiting. Not just any son. He's with the FBI. Has been for years. Trained, serious, sharp, and very, very protective. I didn't have to say anything. He saw her too. He didn't even break his stride walking to the door. Calm, collected. His badge was in his pocket, but his presence said everything before he even opened his mouth. Karen had just bent down to try another key when he opened the door. She jumped back like she'd been caught sneaking cookies in a kitchen she didn't belong in. Her eyes locked on his, and then on the badge clipped to his belt. Dead silence. Then she stammered, "I was just checking for..." "For what?" my son interrupted. "There's no emergency here. You didn't knock. You didn't call. Why are you trying to enter this home?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, steady and calm, like someone used to handling people who thought they had more power than they actually did. Karen blinked rapidly, trying to gather herself. "I have a master key," she said finally, holding it up like it gave her some kind of authority. "For HOA access. It's policy." "No, ma'am," he said flatly. "It's not law. And it does not override private property rights. This isn't a clubhouse. This is a residence. You are not allowed to enter without permission or emergency grounds. Do you have either?" She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. "I thought this was..." "You thought wrong." Karen stepped back, her shoulders stiff. For the first time ever, she didn't have a comeback. I stood behind my son now, arms crossed. Watching her process what had just happened. Her keys jingled slightly in her hand, the bravado clearly fading. And here's the thing. This wasn't just a Karen moment. It was a wake-up call. Because for months, people in our neighborhood had whispered about strange things. Gates found unlocked. Packages missing. Inspections that no one requested. And every time someone asked, the answer was always vague. Always a shrug. Always, "We're just following HOA rules." But there are rules, and then there's the law. What she tried to do. That wasn't just bossy. That was trespassing. She had gotten used to being feared, to being obeyed, to waving that little title of hers around like it meant something more than it did. But she hadn't counted on someone calling her out with actual authority. Someone who knew the law inside and out. My son didn't press charges. He didn't threaten her. He didn't have to. He just reminded her, and everyone watching from behind their curtains, that respect isn't taken. It's earned. And that sometimes, you need more than a clipboard and keys to get past the front door. She didn't walk away immediately. Karen lingered on the porch like she still couldn't believe she'd been stopped. Her grip on the master key ring tightened, and she glanced around as if searching for someone to back her up. But this wasn't one of those HOA meetings where she could bark out orders and expect nods in return. This was my property. And she'd just learned the hard way that not everyone rolls over when she shows up. My son didn't slam the door in her face. That would have been too easy. Instead, he stood there quietly, giving her space to do the one thing she hated most, retreat. Eventually, she took a slow step back, her eyes flicking between him and me like she still didn't know who to blame more for ruining her little power trip. I think she thought we'd be embarrassed. Or that we'd beg for forgiveness. But we didn't say a word. Just stood in our own doorway like people who were done being pushed around. Karen turned, adjusted her clipboard like it gave her authority again, and walked off down the path. Her heels didn't click so confidently this time. My son turned to me once she was gone. "That happen a lot?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "More than you'd think." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. I followed, feeling the shift in energy like someone had finally opened a window in a stuffy room. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. He asked more questions. Had she ever entered the house before? Had anyone else complained? Did the HOA even have written policies about master key use? I told him everything. About the neighbor who came home early from vacation to find a sticky note on her fridge that said, "Inspection passed." About the guy 2 streets over who found his garage door open but nothing stolen, just rearranged. And about the HOA emails that never really explained anything clearly. Just vague lines like routine walkthrough or community standard maintenance visits. My son listened without interrupting, that familiar FBI stillness in his posture. Not angry, just alert. Watching patterns, hearing what wasn't said out loud. "That's not okay," he said finally. "None of this is." I agreed. But what could we do? Play boards had rules. They had bylaws. And they had plenty of ways to silence people who spoke up. Fines, citations, threats of legal action. Most folks just kept their heads down. That's when he smiled. Just a little. "There's a difference," he said, "between policy and power. She's got one. But I've got the other." I didn't know exactly what he meant at first, but I could tell he was already forming a plan. That afternoon, he started digging. He pulled up our HOA's bylaws online, every clause and subclause. Printed them out, highlighted lines, cross-referenced them with state property codes. He made notes in the margins and flagged inconsistencies. Turns out, the HOA's master key policy was never properly documented. It wasn't part of the official charter. It wasn't even something the homeowners had voted on. It was just a habit someone had started, and Karen had run wild with it. Worse, there was no accountability system. No log. No records of when or why the key was used. Which meant anyone on the board could let themselves in and out of homes with zero oversight. By evening, my son had a binder full of proof. He wasn't trying to start a war, he just wanted boundaries. Real ones. The kind that couldn't be ignored just because someone had a shiny badge that said, "board member." I could already imagine the next HOA meeting. Karen sitting in her usual spot, arms crossed, expecting to be respected out of habit. But this time, it wouldn't be whispers or complaints. It would be facts, policies, violations, and a federal agent with a calm voice and a solid case. As the sun dipped below the trees, I looked out the window again. Karen was gone, but something had shifted in the air. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the house we lived in, the one we paid for, cared for, protected, was truly ours again. 2 days later, Karen came back, but this time, she didn't get out of her car. She just sat there in her silver SUV, parked across the street, sunglasses on, arms crossed. Watching. Like she was waiting to see what we'd do next. But I already knew she was rattled. That calm stare she gave from behind the windshield? That was fear dressed as confidence. My son noticed her too. He didn't say a word about it at first. Just walked past the window, paused slightly, then went right back to the table where he'd left his notes. We were ready now. This wasn't just about her trying to enter a house. It was about exposing an entire pattern. That afternoon, we visited 2 other neighbors. People we trusted. Good folks who had been here longer than we had. We started asking quiet questions. Have you ever had the HOA enter your property without asking? The answers came fast, and they weren't good. One lady, Sarah, said she once found a board member inside her fenced backyard, snapping pictures of her flower beds. No notice. No knock. Nothing. She only realized it happened because her dog lost its mind barking, and when she came out, the guy was just walking away like it was no big deal. Another neighbor, Tony, swore someone had been in his garage while he was out of town. The only reason he knew? His tool drawers were rearranged. Nothing stolen, just moved. Like someone had been inspecting things, then left without a trace. And it wasn't just our street. The stories kept coming. Little things that sounded harmless on their own, until you strung them all together. Then it started to look a lot like abuse of power. By the time we returned home, my son had more than enough to take the next step. He opened his laptop, logged into a public records site, and pulled the names of every current HOA board member. Then he checked county property records, scanned legal filings, and dug into background reports. Nothing illegal turned up, but it was clear that Karen had a long history of overreach. She'd been removed from a different HOA years ago, under pressure from residents after a series of unauthorized property checks. So how did she end up on our board now? Because no one had checked. No one asked. And no one ever challenged her. Until now. My son decided it was time to make things official. He filed a formal complaint through the state's HOA regulatory office. He documented everything, not just what happened with our house, but all the neighbor stories we'd gathered. He included printouts of the HOA charter, highlighted missing sections about master key policy, and backed it all with local property rights laws. And then he wrote a letter. Professional. Just a few paragraphs. He addressed it to the HOA board, explaining that a line had been crossed, that policies had been ignored, and that if it continued, legal action wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. He didn't need to use big threats. His words were simple. Every resident deserves the right to privacy and protection within their own home. This is not a suggestion. It is the law. We delivered copies of that letter to every board member. Sealed envelopes. No drama. Just truth. That night, Karen's SUV was gone. For the first time in weeks, our street felt quiet again. Not the uneasy kind of quiet, but peaceful. Like the weight that had been hanging in the air had finally started to lift. And maybe she thought the fight was over. Maybe she figured the letter was the last move. But what she didn't realize was that letter was just the beginning. Because people were finally talking. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the paper and saw something I hadn't seen in months, neighbors standing together. Not avoiding eye contact. Not rushing back inside. They were gathered at the corner, chatting. Laughing. Sharing their own stories. And in the middle of it all was my son. Calm as ever. Just listening. And this time, they weren't whispering about Karen. They were ready to do something about her. The next HOA board meeting was set for Thursday evening. Normally, no one showed up. Maybe 3 or 4 homeowners at most, bored out of their minds, just there to be polite or because they felt obligated. But this time was different. By the time I arrived with my son, the room was nearly full. People who hadn't said a word in years were now seated up front, arms folded, eyes sharp. Some carried folders. Others held printed copies of the HOA bylaws. Word had spread quickly. And not through social media, but through door-to-door conversations, whispered driveway chats, group texts between neighbors who had never even spoken before. Karen was already at the head table. Same old power suit. Same smug smile. But the moment she saw my son walk in, her face twitched. Just for a second. Not fear. Not panic. Just a tiny crack in her perfect mask. She knew why he was there. The meeting began as usual, a boring roll call, approval of last month's minutes. But it didn't stay quiet for long. A man from the back row raised his hand. I have a question about key access. Karen's voice was tight. What about it? My wife found a board member inside our backyard last week, he said flatly. Didn't knock. Didn't announce himself. Just opened the side gate and walked in. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's eyes darted toward the other board members. Another woman stood. You left a note inside my kitchen last year. Remember that, Karen? Said you were checking the smoke detectors. I never gave you permission to enter. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but she wasn't fast enough. My son stepped forward, speaking calmly. We've reviewed the bylaws. There is no formal policy on master key use. No record keeping. No emergency clause that justifies entering someone's home without notice or permission. That's a problem. Karen tried to laugh it off. It's just part of the responsibilities we take on as the board. It's a violation of state privacy laws. My son cut in, holding up a printed sheet of paper. Section 57.91 of the Homeowners Protection Act states that no board member may enter a private residence or enclosed yard without either written consent or a verified emergency requiring first responder involvement. The room went still. He continued, "In the last 48 hours, we've gathered 13 resident statements, all describing unlawful or unauthorized entry by board members. All signed, all documented, and copies have already been filed with the State Housing Authority." Karen blinked. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For once, the Queen of Control didn't know what to say. Another board member leaned into the microphone, clearing his throat awkwardly. "We were under the impression that the policy had been in place for years." "It doesn't matter," my son replied, still calm. "There's no record of its approval. No resident vote. No documentation. That makes it invalid." The other board members looked at each other. Most clearly hadn't known. One even started flipping through his meeting packet like he expected to find something that would magically prove the policy existed. It didn't. Someone from the second row called out, "So what now? Are you going to step down, Karen?" She stood slowly, trying to collect herself. "I've only ever acted in the community's best interest. If anyone was offended by those actions, No one was offended," a voice from the left interrupted. "We were violated. There's a difference." Silence again. Not because people were unsure, but because everything had been said. Everything that mattered. My son sat down beside me, folding his hands. Not smug. Not proud. Just focused. Karen remained standing, blinking rapidly, looking out across a room that no longer feared her. Her power wasn't just slipping, it was gone. But no one shouted. No one stormed out. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming trust. And it was just beginning. The next morning, something strange happened. Karen's SUV was gone. Not just from her usual parking spot, it wasn't anywhere in the neighborhood. Her porch light was off. Curtains drawn. No clipboard. No patrolling. Nothing. People noticed. It didn't take long before the texts started coming in. "Is she gone for good? Did she resign? Did your son report her to the FBI?" We didn't respond to any of it. Not yet. Instead, we focused on what mattered, making sure what happened to us, and everyone else, never happened again. My son started organizing. Quietly but effectively. He didn't need to rally the whole neighborhood with megaphones. He just invited a few people over. Shared coffee and documents. Pointed out the missing sections in the HOA handbook. Showed everyone the holes in the system that Karen had been using for years. And what surprised me most? People cared. Genuinely. You'd think most neighbors would rather mow the lawn and move on. But it turned out, the second they realized they weren't the only ones being messed with, something changed. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a community. And that changed everything. One man, Greg, quiet guy, always kept to himself, stood up during our little backyard gathering and said, "I've lived here 15 years. I thought I was the only one who didn't trust the HOA. Turns out, I've been locking my gate for a reason." Someone else asked how hard it was to call a vote to restructure the board. Turns out, not that hard at all. The rules were already in the charter. Karen just never mentioned them. Why would she? My son printed out copies of the charter. Highlighted the parts no one ever saw. Underlined the section about vote of no confidence, the process by which board members could be removed if enough homeowners demanded it. It wasn't buried. It wasn't complicated. It had just been ignored. That same week, people started signing. First 10, then 20, then over 50. And not one person hesitated. Each signature felt like a little piece of power being handed back to where it belonged. The strange thing? The board didn't fight it. Not really. The remaining members, the ones who hadn't been walking into garages and backyards, stayed quiet. A few even called my son privately to apologize. Said they had no idea what Karen had been doing. Said they were following her lead and now regretted it. One of them, Janet, who handled HOA communications, even gave us access to old emails Karen had sent. That's when things really started to make sense. There were logs, private ones. Karen had kept her own notes about which homes she'd entered and why. and when, and sometimes even how she justified it. Window left cracked open, assumed safety risk. Dog barking nonstop, checked for potential neglect. Front porch unswept, checked for signs of vacancy. No permission. No emergencies. Just her own made-up reasons. The list went on for pages. My son didn't gloat when he read them. He just nodded as if he already expected to find what he found. Then he handed the documents off to the homeowners committee that was forming. That's right. A new committee. One made up of people who actually lived here, who actually cared. Not power-hungry volunteers who treated the neighborhood like a kingdom. The best part? No one was trying to become the next Karen. This wasn't about control. It was about clarity, trust, boundaries. At the next emergency meeting, something happened I'd never seen before. Every seat was full, and nobody was there to argue. They were there to fix things. The vote passed easily. Karen was officially removed from the board. She didn't show up, didn't defend herself, didn't need to, because the silence from her side said everything. The strange silence didn't last long. A week after the vote, a certified letter showed up in my mailbox. Not from Karen, but from her lawyer. 4 pages of tightly written legal talk, accusing us of slander, intimidation, and what she boldly referred to as unlawful defamation of character. She wanted a retraction, an apology. She even demanded that my son step back from community matters immediately. I almost laughed. Almost. But my son didn't find it funny. He read the letter twice, slow and steady, then folded it neatly and set it aside. His expression didn't change, but I could tell something had shifted again, not in anger, but in determination. "This is fear," he said. "She's trying to scare us into silence. But fear only works when you're hiding something." We weren't. He drafted a response the same day. Direct, professional, and backed with every ounce of law she tried to twist in her favor. He laid out the facts, the illegal entries, the improper use of the HOA's name and keys, the personal notes she kept that had now been entered into record. He attached copies of her emails, witness statements, and the HOA's own bylaws to support everything we'd said. No emotion, just truth. He ended the letter with one simple line. "Your client may attempt to intimidate us, but she will not rewrite the facts." We sent the reply by courier. The next few days were tense, not just for us, but for the whole neighborhood. People kept checking in, asking if we were okay, if anything else had happened. And while things were quiet on the surface, we all knew something else was brewing. Sure enough, it did. Karen tried to spin the story her way. Word got out that she was visiting homes again, not in her SUV, but on foot, knocking on doors, trying to convince people that she had been the victim, saying she was misunderstood, that we had twisted her intentions, that my son was trying to start trouble for no reason. But this time, nobody was buying it. Even the neighbors who used to avoid drama were now openly talking about what they'd seen, what they'd personally experienced. And when Karen realized her charm wasn't working anymore, she got mean. Told one couple that their yard wasn't up to code, and hinted they'd be fined. Told another that their new fence might need to be reproved. Empty threats, all of them. But people weren't scared anymore. Because now they had something she never counted on, each other. And my son? He didn't get pulled into her game. He didn't knock on doors or post long rants on neighborhood apps. He just kept organizing. He met with the newly formed committee, helped them draft a new amendment for the HOA charter, one that clearly defined when and how any board member could enter a resident's property. It included strict rules, written notice, homeowner approval, emergency-only access, and full incident reporting. No exceptions. No gray areas. No more, "trust me," nonsense. When the proposed amendment went out for vote, it passed with over 90% support. Karen's remaining allies on the board quietly resigned. New elections were scheduled. Fresh faces joined, real residents with nothing to prove and everything to protect. And while Karen still lurked on the edge of the community, she no longer held a key. Not literally. Not legally. Not socially. People stopped responding to her emails. Her clipboard became just that, a piece of plastic, no longer backed by fear or fake authority. One afternoon, as my son and I sat on the porch sipping coffee, we watched her walk past. She didn't look at us. Didn't nod. Didn't wave. Just kept walking. No clipboard. No SUV. No more power. It was strange how quickly everything changed once people realized they weren't powerless. The same neighbors who used to pull their blinds when Karen came walking were now out mowing their lawns, chatting over fences, and organizing weekend BBQs. The entire mood of the neighborhood had shifted, like someone had opened a window and let in fresh air. One Saturday, the new HOA board hosted a community gathering at the park. Nothing fancy. Just a few tables, some folding chairs, lemonade, and a simple goal: bring people together. And it worked. Families who'd never spoken before were suddenly swapping stories, laughing, and sharing plates of food like they'd known each other for years. My son stood to the side most of the time, sipping from a paper cup and quietly watching it all unfold. He didn't like attention, never had. But everyone knew what he'd done. They knew he was the reason things had finally started to make sense. People approached him anyway. Not to ask for favors, just to say thanks. They shook his hand, clapped him on the back. One elderly woman even handed him a peach cobbler wrapped in foil and said, "For making us feel safe again." He smiled politely and thanked her, but I could tell he wasn't soaking in praise. He was still thinking, still scanning, still making sure nothing would slip through the cracks again. Because Karen wasn't the only problem. She was just the face of a deeper issue. Power without accountability. A system that had been left unchallenged for too long. That's what my son wanted to fix. Not just the surface, but the structure. The new board had already begun making changes. They launched an open access portal where homeowners could view every policy, every budget update, every board vote. No more hidden emails. No more decisions made in back rooms. Everything had to go through the members now. And people cared. They showed up to meetings. They asked questions. They offered ideas. Someone suggested a neighborhood patrol program, not for spying, but for safety. Volunteers who'd simply walk around a few nights a week, check on older residents, help if someone needed a hand. That idea took off fast. Someone else proposed creating a welcome packet for new homeowners, complete with contact numbers, local recommendations, and clear explanations of how the HOA actually worked. Not a threatening list of rules, but a friendly invitation to be part of something. That idea passed in under 5 minutes. It was like the entire place had woken up. And yet, even with all this progress, Karen wasn't entirely gone. Every now and then, someone would mention seeing her at the grocery store, talking a little too loudly in the parking lot. Or standing near the mailboxes, trying to strike up conversations that nobody really wanted. She wasn't shouting anymore. Wasn't threatening. But she was still trying to be relevant. It didn't matter. The system that once allowed her to walk into homes unchecked was now locked down tight. Keys had been reissued. Protocols were enforced. And even if she somehow talked her way back into a position, the rules would stop her this time. And the best part? My son didn't have to be the one enforcing it. The neighborhood had taken the reins. Later that night, we sat on the porch again, watching the string lights flicker across fences and the smell of grilled burgers still floating in the air from the park. "You think it's over?" I asked him. He took a sip from his glass and shrugged. "It's never over. But now they know what to do if it happens again." That was the difference. Before, it was just one person fighting a quiet battle in their own home. Now, it was a community, awake, aware, and finally willing to stand up for itself. A week later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in my mailbox again, but this time, it wasn't from a lawyer. It was handwritten. Thick paper. No return address. Just our house number and my name written in neat, slanted script. I opened it on the porch, with the late afternoon sun pouring across the steps. My son was nearby, trimming a low branch from one of the hedges, glancing up occasionally. I could feel him watching as I pulled the letter from the envelope. It was from Karen. But not the Karen we knew, not the clipboard-wielding, rule-bending force of chaos. This letter was quiet, careful, almost shaky in tone. She wrote that she had stepped down permanently, that she'd sold her SUV, that she was considering moving back to her sister's place out of state. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't beg for sympathy. But what she did say, over and over again, was that she didn't expect it to go this far. She wrote, "I thought I was helping. I thought structure was the same thing as safety. I didn't know people felt afraid of me." I folded the letter back up slowly. My son walked over and set down the clippers. "She finally figured it out," he said, like he'd known this moment was coming the entire time. But I wasn't sure she had. Not fully. Regret is one thing. Change is another. The neighborhood had already moved on. Kids were playing in the cul-de-sac again. People were sharing tools, giving plant cuttings to each other, borrowing ladders and returning them without needing to be asked twice. For the first time in years, it actually felt like people lived here, not just survived here. One family down the street even painted a huge community garden coming soon sign on a wooden board and set it up near the old fountain that never worked. A few folks brought shovels the next day. Someone donated seeds. And just like that, something new started growing in a place that used to feel cold. It was the little things that stood out the most. A neighbor leaving fresh bread at our door with a sticky note that said, "Thanks for waking us up." An older couple who had nearly sold their house suddenly deciding to stay. They said they wanted to be part of this new version of the neighborhood. Even our mailman started lingering at the gate just a little longer, smiling wider, waving like he finally felt welcome on the street. Karen's shadow didn't hang heavy anymore. It had shrunk, faded, replaced by porch lights, laughter, and the kind of silence that meant peace, not fear. But still, my son stayed alert. Not paranoid. Just present. He knew power always tries to find new ways in. He kept helping behind the scenes, quietly making sure the new board stayed transparent. He built a digital log system for key access. Simple, shareable, and public. Everyone could see who had a key when it was used and why. No more secrets. No more surprises. The committee meetings were open now too, held on front lawns or under picnic shelters, where kids could run through sprinklers while parents voted on garden plots and street cleanup days. Nothing fancy. Nothing scripted. Just real people deciding what mattered. And Karen? She never showed up to another one. Not even once. She faded into the background like a bad memory you eventually stop revisiting. Maybe she really did move away. Maybe she stayed locked behind her curtains, watching everything she used to control move on without her. Either way, no one went knocking. Because no one owed her that. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the cicadas started their nightly hum, my son leaned back in his chair and looked out across the yards. Lights twinkled on porches. Someone was grilling again. Music drifted softly from a speaker. He didn't say much. He never did. But his eyes told the whole story. This neighborhood had changed, not because someone forced it to, but because one person stood up, and then another, until finally the silence cracked. And from that crack, a whole new community had grown.